Boa noite a todos. Bem-vindos a mais uma sessão do Em Trânsito, promovido pela secção regional norte da Ordem dos Arquitetos. Hoje com um debate que é um modelo que já testámos o ano passado, numa parceria com o Institute of Ideas de Londres, e com um evento que já vem sendo organizado também com alguma regularidade, que é o Battle of Ideas, que basicamente corresponde a um exercício de liberdade de expressão à volta de alguns temas da atualidade, e com um formato semelhante a este, com um painel com 4 ou 5 oradores e com moderadores, em que cada participante tem apenas 4 ou 5 minutos para contribuir com uma ideia e alargar o debate depois, para além do painel, ao público. O nosso moderador é o Alastair Donald, que vai liderar o projeto, e a quem eu vou passar a palavra. Obrigado.
Hello everyone, my name's Alastair Donald. I'm Associate Director of the Future Cities Project in London. It's great to be back in Porto tonight for a Battle of Ideas international satellite debate called Up Interventions, Don't Believe the Hype. We were in Porto a year ago for the first time we've been to Porto for the Battle of Ideas events, and really enjoyed it and thought it was worth coming back and having a second discussion. This is the 9th year of Battle of Ideas. It's a festival that's grown from a single day in London to a whole weekend now in London. So in 2 weekends' time, the 19th and 20th of October at the Barbican in London, the main festival will take place with 80 debates over the course of a weekend. There'll be 400 speakers in that over that weekend, with more than 2,000 people attending to discuss a whole range of issues and ideas that range from anything from the role of religion through to the meaning of freedom, from the popularity of neuroscience through to the benefits of urban farming, or not, as the case may be. So it's been a fantastic festival for us over the years in London. What's happened over the past 3 or 4 years is that we've expanded the festival into Europe and actually America too. So this is just one international satellite event of about 9 or 10 that will take place in cities around Europe, including Amsterdam, Zurich, Berlin, Prague, Lisbon, we were in last week, and New York over in America. So it's now truly become an international festival. And the whole idea is to set up sessions that are all about public debate. So we're all sort of very familiar these days with having to fill in surveys or to tell local authorities what services we want. But there's actually very little public debate about the substance of ideas about the times that we live in and how we want to create the future. And what we've tried to do with Battle of Ideas is to take subjects and kind of really take them apart and try and dig underneath what's actually going on, and try and understand the world a bit better with a view to, in these problematic times, these recessionary times, understanding how it is that we might be able to change it. The format that we use in most of the discussions that we have is that we invite a selection of speakers on an issue, usually who have differing opinions, don't necessarily agree with each other. We give them a short time to make some introductory remarks, about 5 minutes in this case, and I'll kind of be holding them to that to make sure that they don't go over. And the reason for that is because we're very keen that in a public debate that actually the public have a voice in that, and that you all get the chance to ask questions or to make points, to disagree with them if you want to. So while they're speaking, if you want to think about any questions that you might have, make a note of them as they're speaking if you want. And we'll have hopefully 3/4 of an hour after they've all spoken and after I've asked them a couple of questions to be able to actually discuss what it is they've said. So in Battle of Ideas, architecture has actually been, and urban planning have been subjects that we've found quite useful to discuss. we often try to get beyond the technicalities of architecture and actually try to situate it in the wider world and to look at architectural trends, but look at them in a broader sense in the way that, in relationship to the way that society's developing. Tonight, we've chosen pop-up interventions or performance architecture, however you want to describe it, and kind of associated activities such as urban exploring and tactical urbanism and all these kind of names that have come around in recent years to describe these sort of temporary interventions in cities. And we want to kind of look at them and to kind of ask questions about them, to see if the hype that currently around them just now is justified, to ask why there is a hype around them, to assess if they're a sign of progress, or are they a form of retreat from perhaps larger ambitions, larger architectural ambitions. So that's the sort of issues that I want to discuss over the next hour and a half. So we've got 5 speakers to introduce the subject and to tell us a little bit about their views on things. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. So first up, we're going to have Pedro Bismarck. Pedro is an architect, graduate of the Faculty of Architecture at University of Porto, and he's also lived and worked in Berlin. He's been a tutor at the architecture school in Porto. He's currently doing his PhD there, and his research inhabits a thematic field placed between architecture, space, politics, and vocation. So we might find out a bit more about what he thinks about that. He's also editor of Puncto magazine, which he says is an undisciplined magazine about limits of practice, of theory, of politics and architecture. Next up, we're going to have Joana Varajo. Is that right? I've been trained how to say this. I'm going to have to apologize for my pronunciation even in advance. Joana's the co-editor of Del Deo magazine, which was launched in 2006 by a group of students at the Faculty of Architecture at the University in Porto again. And it was launched as a platform for discussion and intervention. It intends to instigate and promote architectural debate and look at how the discipline correlates with artistic and social movements. They're currently producing the 10th edition, which I think is out in November. It's called Who Lives Next Door, and it's focused on a specific area of the city, Campania, and they host lots of public debates and discussions and workshop activities. So that's Joana. Third up is going to be Carl Sharrow. Carl is on the left there. Carl's an architect, again, a writer and commentator on the Middle East, actually. He's co-author of a manifesto towards New Humanism in Architecture, which you'll find on all the tables in front of you, so worth having a look at that. And that manifesto was actually included in Penguin Modern Classics books of 100 influential art manifestos in the last century. So again, have a look at that. Carl's designed buildings and master plans across Europe and the Middle East. He's also led quite a lot of theoretical projects. And he's the author of numerous articles in various magazines, but also notably a chapter in an excellent book called The Lure of the City, where he wrote a chapter on visionary architecture. Carl, as I said, is an expert on Middle Eastern politics, so he's not just interested in architecture, and written for newspapers like The Independent and online magazines like Foreign Policy, Index on Censorship. Fourth up, on my left, we'll have Fernando Martins, who also graduated from the school in Porto. You all graduated from the school in Porto. It's a very Porto-based session, this. He's worked in various practices, including co-founding Atelier.aberto, He's recently been working in Kuwait, and he's exploring new territories, including experimenting with different ways that creativity and culture influence cities. And for the purposes of this discussion, quite importantly, he was one of the leading members of the team up in Guimarães, 2012 European Capital of Culture, who had a large program in pop-ups, which he was integral to organizing. So that's Fernando. And finally, and not least, is on my far right, and already spoken, so you know him, is Luís Pereira. Did I ever pronounce your name right? I don't think so. Who is, funnily enough, a graduate of Princeton, but also Porto. He's a founding partner of Enda Arquitetura, an architecture studio, and also freelance curator, having worked at the Venice Biennale a few years ago, and also the Lisbon International Architecture Triennale, the first one, actually. Obviously, there's one going on just now as well. He's several advisory roles, including on creative industries in northern Portugal, and on the European Cultural Parliament, and he's been vice president of the northern chapter of Portuguese Architects. I'm extremely grateful to Luís because he's helped me organize this session tonight, put a lot of work into it, along with Adriano Castro, Anna May, and Paulo, all from the northern chapter. So extremely grateful to them for actually making this session happen. So that's enough from me. I think over to Pedro for 5-6 minutes at the most.
7. Okay, thank you. I took some notes and reflections about the subject of the temporary architectures. I just want to say that these reflections or notes came from 3 recent experiences: the workshop that Dedel organized in last May, a recent article that I wrote for Jornal dos Arquitetos, and also my recent passage to the Triennale of Lisbon. So, in fact, we have to recognize the success of these temporary architectures. I think they have to do with 2 main reasons. On one end, the will of a certain younger generation to question the current architectural production system, this star system, taking shape in this rejection of the basic Vitruvian principle of the firmitas. This rejection or abandonment gives to this practice a certain feeling of rupture against the status quo, against the exhaustion and dead end of the established project. By the way, the Lisbon Triennale, it's an example of this address. On the other hand, these architectures seem to engage also a kind of political and social activism discourse, along with a call to new ways of interaction with the city, feeling a certain frustration towards our relation with the city and its process of government. However, I think that these 2 reasons are equivocal. That is, neither these architectures correspond to any operative strategy of questioning the architectural production, neither this discourse of political urban activism is in fact real. That's what I will try to argue, raising 3 small questions. The first has to do with the total indistinctness that reigns under this classification of the temporary architectures, as it would be possible to put together such different practices with such different strategies and purposes. There is, I would say, a certain illiteracy of the critic in this level, which is much more interested in the discourse of the generational rupture and the exits from the crisis, promoting them as archetypes of a new architecture, than to understand what lies beneath them, what are their motives, and mainly what makes them different. On failing to do this, the critic shoots itself in the foot and in the future of the discipline. At the same time, this illiteracy, this lack of distinctness, ends up to neutralize the work of the very few indeed interested in problematizing architecture and not just themselves. This is precisely the point of my second argument, the fact that many of these practices, despite all the speeches that they have taken borrowed, don't have any political or disciplinary critical position. They are no more than the result of a new configuration of the financial capital. As temporary architectures, they are indeed precarious architectures for precarious times. light structures, low cost, flexible, perfectly suitable to the new needs of the markets and of the urban marketing that has turned the cities into thematic parks. To summarize, they are not the new shape, they are the new shape of the financial capital, fluid, rapid, precarious, and not the critic to this politics of capital reconfiguration, with all its unbalances and injustice. These architectures have nothing of rupture or experimentation, nothing of political activism, and if they disturb the principle of the firmitas, is only to adapt themselves to the new needs of the financial capital. The last question has to do with the fact that most of these architectures ground their strategy in a certain space of the enjoyment, of the ludic, which is contradictory with any discourse of political or social emancipation. The slogans that they preach toward the cool subversion of the rules of the urban daily life, the calls to the city as a playground and as a field for new and amusing ways of interaction give us the illusion that we are members of a community, that we are even active and attentive citizens. But they are no more than small toys that capture and amuse our free time. They turn the city into a commodity as any other and turn us into consumers of a product and not in real citizens. The paradox of these architectures of enjoyment can be stated, I think, in the following way. The more they spread throughout the cities, the more they turn the city into a cool place and playground, more advanced is the privatization of public spaces, the violent gentrification process, the real estate speculation, and finally, more advanced is the state's privatization. In short, the more they proclaim that the city is ours, more this one and the state become property of a few. These enjoyment architectures are no more than fetish, precisely substitutes of a right to which we have renounced, the right to the city. And the enjoyment that they give to us is no more than a compensation for our frustration and alienation before the city, before the political processes. This, 1 minute. But I would like to stress that I'm not including all the practice that in a way or another use these temporary architectures, but precisely the need to draw a separation line between the ones that are engaged in thinking a certain political and social role of architecture and the others that in their behalf, taking advantage of those political discourses, are no more than empty roles, marketing strategies of a power that while entertains the free time of that small bored and discouraged planetary bourgeoisie, dissimulates the true nature of its neoliberal politics. To end up, these temporary architectures can be, in its small scale of intervention, operative ways of disturbing our alienation before politics, of promoting process of participation in local government. And this should well be a decisive field for thinking the role of architecture in the next future. But this will be only possible if we are sure to understand who is doing what and in whose behalf. And most of all, it will be only possible if we address the question of how one can rethink the relation between architecture and politics. That is, how architecture can be a response to the true crisis of our time, the crisis of democratic institutions, of this violent reconfiguration of the financial capital. And so, how can architecture contribute to draw new ways of accessing to politics, draw new spaces of the common, of promoting process of social but also political emancipation, and also, I'm finishing, exposing, give visibility to the ones that remain always in the edge, in the shadow of the dominant discourses. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm here as a co-editor of the 10th edition of Daedalus magazine. And as Alistair already said, we are representing a publication that started in 2006, which started as a theoretical platform. But one of the main purposes of our intervention this year was to turn a theoretical approach into a practical one and to have some kind of a role in the city and to observe some kind of response to a way of thinking. So our subject was who lives next door, And with this, we tried to react to an abstract and global approach, which sorry. So we tried to understand the local instead of the global, which and to try to advance regarding an academic approach which we had for throughout our course, which was thinking about space as a concept or something more formal. So we tried to react by choosing a place in the city to act or to think. So we had a choice between looking at the city and thinking about opportunities or about problems. So we could either contribute to a movement and a certain dynamics that the center already has, and or we could try to think about the city as regarding the problems that it has, and we focused on the east side as a forgotten part of the city, which was Campanhã. And we thought about it through a process. So we chose that part of the city, and we began by getting to know the place. And we tried to gather information, and we did many walks there, and we collected the opinion of the people who lived there. And then we had two other phases. One of them was, we called it planning for action, which we developed with 5 work teams of work. So we basically went to Campanhã, and we tried to work there in constant interaction with the people, and trying to understand their own views of the problems and the specific needs of that environment. Now we are planning to, and so from that intervention we have 5 projects that came up from the teams of work, and now we want to select one of the projects and try to contribute to that part of the city alongside with the inhabitants. So what we want to, with this process that we developed and experimented, what we wanted to question, and it indirectly questions the theme of the conference, which is pop-up interventions. It's the difference between the concept of pop-up, which is something that appears and it's unexpected and just arises, and nobody knows why or from where. In contrast with a process that is initiated in the place, and people understand why it arrives there and how it grows, and they can actually be a part of that growth, and it's pretty much this.
Unusually for me, I'm going to start with a little story. I might do a song as well, but it depends. And that's because this whole discussion has reminded me of my only experience with a pop-up intervention about 15 years ago, showing my age a bit there. And this is back in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. I lived there for 12 years, and there was an art festival, and I hit on this idea. The city isn't that dissimilar to Porto, but there's a very busy street, I had a very narrow active sidewalk, and I had this idea to have an intervention over there. So I applied for a grant, got it. I had this great ideas that I'm going to, just recently graduated architect. I'm going to do an intervention on the sidewalk. I'm going to engage the public. It's going to be hot stuff. I'm going to put all my theories into action. So I decided to put these boxes that are 60 by 60 by 240, spaced at 60-meter intervals, fill the sidewalk with it. Got permission for it, got the funding, went on the day, started putting them up. And I noticed this man who old man, polishes shoes for a living, sitting there and watching intently. And I'm thinking, I've captivated this man already. We're building something, this man is loving it, I'm engaging with the public. We put all of this and we completely filled the street. And when I finished, I went over to him, I was really excited. And he said, so what do you think about this? This is really great, it's going to animate the area, it's going to make everybody happy. He looked at me and like, you completely ruined my business. Nobody can see me where I'm sitting now over here. And the man was completely devastated. So I had to take all the money that I had paid and pay the man for the next 2 weeks. And that was the last experience that I ever had with pop-up architecture intervention. It was a really painful experience for me. So you can understand that I'm coming to this with a bit of hostility to the idea. And in a sense, I share Pedro's critique, although not necessarily agree with the extent of the role that pop-up interventions themselves play in the emerging new order, but I do share on two main points that I'm going to discuss. One is, to me, pop-up interventions represent a distraction from the possibility of a new architecture. We've fallen as an architectural community or an architectural discipline into this habit of postponing the kind of the persistent questions, how do we reinvent and recreate architecture and urbanism for our time? And this is not a mere indulgence. There are big questions for an increasing population that demands a higher quality of life, all sorts of problems that really demands very fundamental rethink about how we do architecture. So far, for the past 50, 60 years, we've been just multiplying the models that we've inherited from the past. So to me, the fact that we switch from that mode of thinking, what is the next big step forward in architecture, to what seems to be a distraction and abdication of responsibility has very little impact on the world, represent a kind of failure of our generation to do what every generation in the past did. And it was able to create an architecture after its own image, its aspirations, its politics, and its philosophy and outlook. That's one. Two, there is the illusion of engagement and liberation and freedom that's marketed with this idea of pop-up intervention and kind of the social dimension and the fact that we can actually create a social agenda for our work, that again I find not quite satisfying, and it actually sells something that it doesn't actually provide. And to me, the idea here is if we want to engage people, we need to give them more freedom, not provide them with temporary, superficial, transient, and kind of quickly disappearing experiences. If we really want to be true to the meaning of these ideas that we're suggesting, we have to kind of transgress all the boundaries that we've inherited, the over-regulation, the hyper-regulation of public space, the inability of people to shape their environment physically. Go everywhere in Europe, if you wanted to put one piece of stone on top of another, you need all sorts of permissions and all kinds of authorities that regulate that. To me, the question of freedom lies in the fact of saying, no, if you really want to create a transgressive, open, engaging architecture that's based on self-building, you need to be political about it, and you need to give people the freedom to do that. In other words, go out there and argue against the institutionalization of the field of architecture. And then that becomes an interesting question. So to me, not to dismiss entirely the practice, there can be really interesting ideas out there that you can use them as experiments, for example, to forward architecture. So I wouldn't be kind of all on a moralistic level about it. But what I would be warning against, and that's my closing point, is we're distracting ourselves by not really taking on the responsibility of creating this new radical form of architecture that we really should be propagating. Thank you.
Okay, I was planning on telling a small story about the whole thing about Guimarães, where I had the opportunity to work. And in fact, the time is very short, so we have to be more objective. And what I could come out of this experience leading, or dealing with several ideas that can integrate this pop-up concept is actually quite positive. But first, a very important thing is that I think is an error to consider this pop-up interventions as something that's a big bag where you can put everything, like tactical urbanism or guerrilla gardening or performance architecture. All of those have different purpose. So putting everything together is at the first, for me, it's a mistake. There's a purpose for each of those. Some are very close to what Pedro was saying. Who is commissioning? What are we doing? Who is gaining from this? Because, of course, pop-up shops are basically a marketing strategy, not particularly, but they do change the city at some point. They do permit some changes to happen. But in all of those, there are a few experiments that happen in Guimarães that I think should be at least thought about. We had the opportunity to do something because we had money. Somebody was giving us money from the European Union, so okay, let's try something new in a city that actually has a very conventional and not heavy, but a legacy, a very strict, defined way of doing, of city making. And we had the opportunity to try something else. And for me, it was very, very fortunate to have, even in the program, other things happening with extreme interests. For example, performance architecture and arts and architecture, which was very interesting to see what those minds from elsewhere could implement. Maybe fun interventions, maybe things that made people think. But it was clear that there was a purpose, there was an artistic strategy. And when we were involved in this, we had to choose where we want to do things, where we want to intervene. And one of the areas that we chose was actually had everything we needed. It was very central. It was neglected, but also had an intervention in a more conventional urban way, like urban space was being renovated, everything was happening, but there was still space among archaeological, industrial structures to do something that basically could be just a piece of land with a lot of garbage. And we thought, okay, let's make this a place where this neighborhood that actually lost a bit of its identity because of its history, that I could explain, but I don't have time, and we can do something here that can permit Guimarães to acknowledge another possibility of faster possibility to do something else. And that happened with some, I would say, relative success, because everything was, it's difficult to distinguish what is the event and the fireworks and all the good things happening from what is the actual outcome of those interventions. The thing is, what is the legacy we left? What is the memory for that space? And clearly it changed. If anybody goes there and asks and expects from that particular place that now is empty again, they expect more because they know that it can happen. And this may be a change in why usually we're used to see public space as something that can just accommodate big events. We put a stage, there's a band, there's something, there's interventions, there's a market. All of these are also historically easy to fit in our process of thinking, but we can do more. Although the laws and regulations can be difficult to deal with, but in that case we had the opportunity to think about it and to make people that don't usually talk to each other do it. And people from City Hall, with the local people, with artists, with passers, a lot of people just found a place when they could talk and do something and change the way they were living this particular bit of space. So in that way, we were political, we didn't have to say it. We didn't have to put a billboard saying we're going to be. We could just be. And those things, if done in a certain layer of intervention, not overlapping those big issues about the future of architecture and everything else, somebody's thinking about it. If we think about those layers of intervention, if they're integrated, they are coordinated with the institutions at some point, they have to, with the people that living in those places, then changes can be made slowly, maybe faster. They won't work maybe sometimes, but then again, it's low risk, low cost, so the best thing that can happen is just do somewhere else, and do another way with the people that live in that place. But this is very general, very not very clear, or at least I could talk about the experience by itself. But I think it's more important to think that maybe I don't believe the hype, but I do believe it's an important process that should be thought about and dealt in a more serious way. That's all.
Well, my first thinking is about pop-up and about the definition in a dictionary about to appear or happen, especially suddenly or unexpectedly. And my reasoning is about the idea of instantaneity, and apparently what becomes a drive for instant gratification. I mean, versus processes that actually take time and effort, right? So part of the discussion, I think, even at the Triennale, was in Lisbon, was in fact that building the traditional profession of architecture is a kind of boring stuff that people are driving away from, especially young people. It's filled with obligations, with the responsibilities, with liabilities, with a kind of a risk that a lot of people are not willing to take. And instead, they're more willing to try for more fun and sexy stuff. So this is part, for me, of the problem with again, one of the readings of the pop-up. An interesting thing about pop-up is that it already has the pop in it, right? I mean, pop-up is obviously a sound of the movement, but it's actually, I mean, if we look at archigram, for instance, we find both of these, both the interest to have things very quickly and very fast, but also about popular culture. And looking at popular culture as a feeding into architecture, right? And so I think that part of popular culture is obviously fun, and I think there's no problem about fun, but there's a problem about being critical. And I think that where we draw the line is not so much in terms of where it is political or not political, but whether it is honestly intellectual effort about, or critical effort about what you're actually engaging in. Another issue is the issue of part of this experiments are also questioning the idea of client, the traditional idea of client, where an architect or any other author, a painter, an artist, whatsoever, works for a client for a specific commission, and that there is an illusion that you are actually short-circuiting this process. But in fact, who is the client? There is always a client, even if it's yourselves. Or like Guimarães, Cultural Capital, Triennale, any kind of cultural institution who commissions these kind of interventions mostly, they become the clients. And suddenly it's a kind of a masturbating effect where you're actually working for the profession rather than working for the people. And I think that is another issue that I think would be interesting to look at in this discussion. A final argument or final point for the debate is actually that all these things, apart from some of the processes which are actually engaging with local communities, with people, But all of them are heavily supported by the idea of visibility. And when Pedro was talking about giving more visibility to those who are in the fields subterraneously without visibility, I'm not sure that visibility is an issue. I mean, I'm not sure that visibility is what you need to become more effective or to become more interesting. So this is, in fact, I think visibility is actually short-circuiting again the process, because what are you aiming for? What kind of result is that? What you want is the visibility of the process. You want beautiful pictures, you want media advertising, or you want some kind of effect on the people you're working with?
I think it would be worth actually starting off with a question, a fairly basic question actually, as to why pop-ups have become so popular. Because there seem to me to be, amongst the various comments there, several explanations for why. Some of you thought it was because local engagement is important. Others because, Luís, you mentioned instant gratification. Pedro mentioned it's precarious architecture for precarious times. There's obviously an implication hanging over all of this discussion that it's a response to recession and cutting our cloth to certain times. So it kind of just would be useful, I think, to try and nail down why it is that pop-ups and temporary architecture, tactical urbanism, and all the stuff, and I sort of take the point about them all being slightly different, but at the same time I'd argue actually that there's actually a lot of connections between the two of them, and if we kind of understand collectively why all of these things have come about just now, then it might leave us in a better position to assess whether this is a useful intervention and contribution to the development of architecture. So kind of why have they come about? Does anybody want to take it on?
I'll take a stab, and I think I'm drawing on a lot of what was said there is, I think they are a very low risk way, and you may have mentioned that very specifically, of intervening in the public realm or in terms of shaping the city. So there is a burden, I think so people like pro-utopias, like myself, pro-experimentation, often forget what happened in the 60s or after World War II, where a lot of bad architecture was done, and we probably don't pay enough attention to that. But I think experimentation, for example, in the 60s was, let's go out and build whole new cities from scratch. And that sense of the 60s, everything is possible, we can transform the world, who are we kidding? Doesn't exist anymore. My venture would be, we live in a much more low horizon world, a world with, we take very, very little risk. And I think the attraction and the appeal over there is precisely because it appears to be a fundamental transformation of the world, when it actually is very low risk, very little hanging on the balance. So I think in a way it's a retreat from that idea of experimenting in architecture and urbanism that is very low cost and very low risk.
Because, I mean, obviously, a lot of the stuff that I read on pop-ups, it makes the claim for it to be experimental. I mean, that's part of the sort of supporting literature for all of this stuff, is that this is new ways of experimenting. So it kind of, you know, Carl's saying it's not. Is anybody wanting to put the counter-argument?
Not really a counter-argument, but even if in the 60s we thought, or somebody thought they could build cities from scratch, change the world, everything else, the truth is, in some places in the cities, there was transgression, there was other things being done, and this is where it's, I won't say that's where it's born, but this idea that there are other ways that you can take an object or a space and use it because it's empty, because we need it, and we don't have to depend on a lot of complicated things just to appropriate. This idea that we need to go back to this basic, this is a need, I think. This is basically a need. The cities are complicated, overlayered, lots of interests. Everything is, I would say, not defined because there's still room for something. The thing is, what was transgression and what was the, I don't know, from graffiti we talked about, squatting, whatever, all of those processes that was actually outlaw, clearly outlaw. Now we think about those processes. They have something that they can teach us. This, I believe, clearly. The thing is, how do we incorporate this process and we make it a layer of actual intervention, small scale, low risk, not incompatible with the actual urban planning.
Is that a positive thing?
I do think it's very positive.
So low risk is a positive
Yes,
response.
low risk, less economic requests, but still we can activate, change small things. We start in the streets, we start in the neighborhood, we change gradually, we work with the people, we introduce the knowledge, we introduce a different perspective, we mix things, and eventually, and this has happened in a lot of cities, changes occur and then become a rule. But at first, there is a very interesting example, which is actually funny. The bouquinistes, the guys that sell books in Paris along the Seine River, were in the beginning clandestine in the 50s. I don't know exactly when, I remember vaguely the story. And then they were expelled. They couldn't send books in this space because, of course, it wasn't regulated. Then it got regulated. Then they were all given a specific space, and now they're UNESCO heritage. Those things take time, but we have to try. We have to change small things to make big changes later. Because the other possibility, the one that is about urban planning, which is about artistic expression, everything will continue to happen. Because one of the things that I think this pop-up trend is at least quite common now, this is the way to get closer to people, to express themselves, whatever.
Right, we'll come on to that. But anybody else on this question of why pop-ups have come around just now?
Picking up what you were saying, I was remembering a sentence of Walter Benjamin that is when he was discussing about the relation between art and the statization of art and fascism. He was saying that it gives the possibility to express, but not certainly he said that they give us the possibility to express, but certainly not to express our rights. And it sometimes with this pop-up, temporary, whatever we can call it, and we should get new names to understand what you are speaking and deal with. I think this is the main problem of many of these temporary architectures. They in fact give us the possibility to express ourselves, especially they come to this frustration that we feel towards the city, towards the fact that we are more and more alienated and separated from the decision project, the process, the political process. But they are just what I was saying, I think. I think they are just fetishes, they substitutes. And this is for me the main problem is how we can trace this separation line and see what are the guys that are really interested in criticizing this political discourse, bringing it to architecture, and not what are the other guys that are just picking up in kind of fashionable models and roles, you know. And I think this is because what is happening is you see a lot of people very hysterical about pop-up and temporary architecture, saying, no, I'm really working with people now, you know. I really feel that I'm being very useful because I'm working with proximity, you know, with neighborhood, with community, because I'm being political. Yeah, but operatively, you know, in the field, this is true, because I'm not to say that I'm making temporary architecture and I'm being political is not enough, because they are, I think, in a way, that's what I was saying, they are only being a response to the new economical order, the new configurations of the capital. You know, they are temporary because they also. We see that this marketing around the cities, they are the big clients of the pop-up architectures. And this is completely contradictory to any discourse, in my perspective at least, to any kind of process of political emancipation, because they are transforming the city in a commodity, in a product, and make of us not citizens, but only consumers of another product that we can consume in any other place in the shopping, you know. So I think this is, for me, it's the main problem. I think they can be very, like you were saying also, they can be very operative ways to arrive to new way of make political activism, but we have to understand what this means word political first. And I think in this moment is more like a fashionable concept than a real and operative concept. This is my problem. This does not mean, and I think the workshop that Dedel organized, it was very clear. There are people that were very interested in a political commitment, but there are others that were making with other purposes. This is not wrong. This is not wrong. What I'm criticizing is that they take sometimes the discourse of the political activism to make a work that is not political. And I think this is the separation that we have to draw. So you
think that the architecture should be more political? Is that what you're saying? That politics should express itself through this architecture?
Architecture is political.
So I think I can only speak as a student, but I think the workshop we did came from the lack of something that we felt during our course, which came from the abstraction and always feeling that we were responding to some set of needs that were very specific, but also very polarized. So I think the question of resources is something that we have to deal inevitably, because especially for someone who is beginning, they don't come around very easily. But I think it's a question of method. So either you have the interventions that use low resources to try to make something visible and something that you can react to, or you can understand the concept, the context of the place you're in, and try to use very few resources to do the little that you can do in a very specific context.
I mean, one of the things that I identify as the why of the success of pop-ups is actually the lack of memory or the loss of memory, and the fact that young people are not trained or interested in the past. I think they're inventing anew things that have been done and tried again. So this is one thing. The other thing is there is definitely a seduction of transgression, of revolution. I mean, use the word appropriate, hijack. You know, I mean, like I think Pedro, you could use the expression hijack. The use of words like guerrilla and stuff to certain anodynous, inoffensive. Well, I think this is offensive. Well, harmless interventions is really turning it all upside down and making it very easy again. Like the idea of easy versus difficult, fun versus boring, and that stuff, right? So I mean, this is part of the success from my point of view.
Just because of this thing that Luís was saying, that the idea that you don't want to commit with something, and that you were saying about this is interesting. Also, I was not thinking about this because this instantaneous, how you say, gratification that you get, that you have, and the fact that they are always very short 10 projects, they kind of took out this idea of commitment with something that has a long term. I think this is very interesting about. It's why I think this precarious. It's also to do about like an image of what is around us. You are precarious because they oblige you to be precarious, like you are precarious in your job, like you are precarious in your life, in your relations, you know, in everything. And so architecture is also. So we can say that in terms of if you want to have a political engaged discourse, you could probably say, no, I don't want to make temporary architectures, I should be precisely the opposite. This could be an answer to a kind of resistance, if we could speak like this.
Okay, lots of things coming out here. I'm still interested in your opinions on why pop-ups have come around. There's kind of this squabble going on here on my left between Carl and his suggestion that this is kind of low risk and low horizon. Fernando saying, well, things start small and build big. So there's kind of, we can try and work that out. There's this question also about whether we should be pursuing politics through architecture, whether architecture is the means for political and social regeneration. So kind of all things that perhaps you're thinking about. We'll hopefully get your opinions, but I just want to give Fernando the chance to come back on one of those comments before, and then it's out to you lot.
Just the thing that I said when I started, that putting everything in the same bag is a mistake by definition, because if you look at the architecture in general, this fetishism exists, and it's made to last. It's made for photographies. It's the problems. It's not a problem by itself. It's part of the system. So, of course, it will happen if somebody does temporary stuff. The problem will also happen there. But if anybody noticed, I didn't actually use temporary architecture a lot of times. This is only one possibility of those processes. Those processes can be done with several kinds of intervention that may include buildings something, but maybe we don't need. We just need to interact and do, or just look and use differently something that is already done. So this kind of approach that has been done by several architects and artists in different eras. We look at history at some point and we see this. Okay, but what have we learned from this? So how do we use the city that we have, that is there, that everybody is living in a different way, just by using it differently? So of course there will be somebody doing something for his own ego, or doing nice photographies and creating this buzz, which is a specific buzz for a specific community, but there will also be people interested in changing some of the city with a buzz that is actually local, or just improving something. There are several examples, a lot of them in Canada and whatever, in a lot of countries, just like changing traffic with painting streets. There's a lot of things that can be done and improve life, less accidents, it's proven. It's something that can be done. The idea is what we learned from this and what we can do that actually has an effect, besides all of those tons of other things. Sorry.
Okay. I think there's a question in that as to whether, what's our ambition for change? I mean, if it's painting streets and having a bit less traffic accidents, that's one magnitude of ambition. In the middle of a recession, of economic collapse, then there might be something a bit more ambitious that we need to think about. But that's something that we can come back to. So I want to come out to you for any thoughts and points on anything that's been said before, any criticisms, disagreements, or if you support what one of the speakers has said, then feel free to chip in.
I wasn't planning to disagree on you, Luís, but I have to disagree. I don't believe that young people don't want or don't care about the past. What I think is that it's the outlook of the new that is different. The idea of the original that was somehow set by the star system of architecture, that's something they can't cope with. They want something else. I would like to pick on 2 or 3 things. The idea of visibility, maybe we should change that word with voice. And I think it's very important that people are given voice somehow. And also the idea of time. And I think there's somehow an antagonism that is felt here that I think has no reason to be, which is between a relational, critical, more engaged with the community, temporary kind of practice, and the architecture that used to be done somewhere when there was money. And I don't think they are necessarily in antagonism. And I think Joana said something very important. It's not about what pops up. It's about building some critical ground in which to engage and give people tools to actually relate to things, temporary or not. So I have a question for the architects, because I'm not an architect. How do you bridge between that kind of practice that is relational, critical, temporary, engaging, and the need for housing and corporate buildings and state buildings? How do you bridge those two things?
I was wondering why you, or maybe forgive me if I forgot that, why you didn't mention something about internet, because there's something about popping up in the internet, and architecture is very helped by new graphism, I suppose, and things like that from the internet. So you use a lot of things from the internet. So this generation, this new generation you were mentioning before, who has no ambition, I think it's just, there's, Carl was saying it's a failure of our generation not having many ideas, but they have many ideas, but they just are, I think they are based on how internet has changed our brains, our ways of thinking, and so we can't go back to that. We can't. And also, internet has changed this new generation, according to me, about memory. You were saying that this new generation has a loss of memory, but our memory has changed. Our way of remembering things or doing things now has changed because of internet. And all these things about advertising, Luís said too, and visibility, and I want to be visible, etc., comes because of that change of this internet, how it has changed our world. That's my point.
I was hearing a lot about division between architecture and pop-up spaces, and I'm wondering why you see this big division between architecture and temporary architecture, how you call it, and I'm also wondering why you cannot see temporary architecture or pop-up spaces as a tool for urbanism. Why these little things, what is still a city? No, I think you cannot define city just by architecture. City has maybe there are people also what don't see nothing in architecture. Maybe they have other interests. They see city in different ways, and why you cannot see these tools, but not just made by architects. Also, other people are making small things in the city, and you can call them however you want. But why you cannot see these things as a tools what you can combine with architecture or with strategy, urban planning? So. This is my question.
Okay, that's very useful.
You were saying the end of the intervention, isn't this lowering down the expectations? Isn't this important? And I think this was kind of answered with what was told. Meanwhile, so yeah, we have real problems, real things to deal with daily, and of course there are magazines to fill, but we have also a job to do. I don't know, I think it's called a responsibility. If the tools are temporary or permanent, I don't think it's important. I think if it can cause a good effect, if it can change something, mentality or physically or socially or something, then it's useful. Then there is the problem about, again, mixing everything together and trying to see why this become so popular. But again, the internet has something to do with this, because nowadays we can know what's happening everywhere. We can create networks to work. We can easily learn from one another. So in different places and see that there's an experience that works well in somewhere in the world, and we can try to learn from this and do it right there in the neighborhood. So yes, the internet influenced this process in some way. There's all social process change with it. So I think basically that's it.
Actually, the internet has a time limit. I mean, if you look at things, I don't know, 10 years ago, before 10 years ago, you can't find them. Things that happened 10 years ago, you can't find them in the internet. Of course, you have like Wikipedia that has a lot of information on things general information, etc. But like the regular information, it's basically from 10 years onwards, let's say. And that is really, and if you're using the internet, you're bound to be limited by that time lapse. But that's not really the point of the memory loss. I mean, it's more about some stances that I see some artists and architects make about their work as original or as innovative, where you have seen that before. I mean, 20 years prior, 40 years prior, whatever. So this is my point about the loss of memory. I mean, obviously, we have more information now than ever, but still we have more loss of memory than ever. The star system is another issue because it's really complicated matter. I mean, people like Ortner and Ortner or Kupimanbau, for instance, in Austria, they are star architects, right? They're star system. They're doing big museums, etc. And they were doing pop-ups in the 60s, right? They were doing experimental stuff in the 60s. And now they're like really boring companies, right? You know, the pop-ups today, these young people experimenting, I mean, some of them will go this long way of star system in some time in the future. So I don't think that there's really a want to be outside of the system permanently, or that there is any value in transgression. Absolutely. In fact, one of the most interesting associated projects that I saw in the Triennale in Lisbon was a research study by Princeton. Hello, which was radical pedagogies, and this was about researching on experiments in pedagogy since the 50s to the 70s, more or less, in Europe, America, South America, and one of the things that we discussed there was that the thing about radicality is really a short time episode. You can't have radicality for a long time. If it succeeds, it becomes absorbed by a mainstream in a way, or if it succeeds because it's so radical that it dies. So it's a kind of a no-can-win, you know, situation in radicality and transgression. And I mean, it's fine, but it's not a purpose. About bridge building, or about bridging, very quickly. Again, I mean, I don't see any contradiction either necessarily, right? In fact, we have had precisely this kind of experiments in Portugal with the housing problem after the 1974 revolution, where architects were working with populations and trying to understand their needs, but again, like they were not empowering the people, right? I mean, this is the thing about you're not really giving the people the tools to make architecture and retreating yourself. Like, you need to work with the people, but then you need to impose a specificity of the discipline, of the architecture, right? I think this is very important, and this is actually part of the discussion that we have here. Is it that we can have everyone constructing or doing architecture, or is it really a specific discipline that you need really training and so you need to give that space, that specific space for professionally trained architects, let's say.
Okay, Pedro, do you want to answer this question about whether architecture is capable of creating social regeneration and you know, what's the relationship between the two? Because you've talked quite a lot about needing to clarify that, and it seems to me that a lot of what's been said about pop-ups generally and on the panel tonight indicates that there's a sense that by involving architects involving themselves in these kind of small-scale temporary projects, that it shapes communities, and it has something to give in terms of social regeneration, if you like. So do you think that's true?
It's a good question. I think we have to see first. I think we were speaking about, is architecture political? I think it's political but it's not in the way that it is always object of the policies, of the politics. It's political because it's a device that disposes things, objects, divides space, creates places, hierarchizes spaces, establish what can be seen, what is hidden, hierarchize the order which things appear, It's organize our activities, the time of our daily life. So this is political. Maybe it's a little bit abstract what I'm saying, but it's the truth. And I think because we are dealing with space, and space is the metrics on which our daily life occurs. So the question is whether we want to be conscious or not conscious of this political side of architecture. I mean, it's always political. The question is, the question, let me put in this in another way. Sometimes we say, I know, I'm not political because I'm being pragmatic. I'm very pragmatic. My architecture and my strategy is always pointing to pragmatism. And I no longer have ideology. But pragmatism, it's an ideology. And what we have to understand, even if we don't know that, even if we say that we are not being political, we are always being political. Even if someone is deciding what we are doing in space. And I think this is the awareness that the architects should have in relation to their work. They should know that they are working to someone, it's a client, to a system, to an order. And at least we should recognize what this system is imposing and how we are transforming this space. Okay. Then is the way, if in real process, in small process like the temporary architecture, we can really engage a connection with the local authorities, with the local neighbors. And I think maybe Joana, with the experience of the Campanhã, can tell us if it's true or not. Because in a way, we went to the workshop in Campanhã, we went to a place that was not part of our daily routine and tried to engage a kind of critical discourse with these neighborhoods.
Okay. Do you want to answer that, or do you want me to come back in a minute? Because the reason I ask is because all the time just now I see architects describing themselves as socially responsible, as political, and yet it just seems to me that the acts that they're undertaking are actually quite problematic. I mean, they don't often seem to be making any headway in terms of resolving wider political problems, and in fact, perhaps you might say that they're getting in the way sometimes. I don't know what anybody thinks about that, but Carl, maybe answer that.
Yeah, I want to come on this specifically. I mean, we sometimes delude ourselves as architects with our real extent of our political power because architecture is a political discipline. So there's the point about tools over there and of that. Architecture is a very clunky tool with which to do politics. If you want to make a political point, I always say to people who tell me I'm doing this as a subversive thing. Well, if you have a point, just say it. Don't go and build a building to express it, because that's not just the right, most effective way to do politics. Where architecture becomes political is the question of power. So you have to ask yourself questions when there's 20% of population is forbidden from having access to land or better housing or resources or whatever. That's where architecture is political. You won't solve that by going out there and patronizingly patting them on the back and saying, we're going to build you this nice little red shining house, it's going to be there for a week, you're going to feel part of a community. That's completely patronizing. This connects me back to the question of voice. You can't give people voice. This is a bureaucratization, a sort of the EU world in which we live in which everything comes back to this officially orchestrated way of engaging and kind of patronizingly saying we're giving people voice. No, you don't make change like that. Big changes happen when people for themselves reject a kind of revolt against the institutions of power. Now, when you want to think about your architecture potential in that process, you ought to be going out there and saying, don't accept what they're telling you, don't accept all these limitations, don't be restricted by what we're putting on you, kick back, go out there, get the land, get the resources, and fight back against that. Don't go and play like a little kid with this little tent that they want you to play in that's sponsored by the EU. That's when you have your voice. Otherwise, who are we kidding? We can't be radical by EU-sponsored initiatives. This is just a distraction. It's a waste of time. So to me, ultimately, the question is be aware of what is your political potential as an architect, and don't try to force political acts on architecture that it cannot do.
Okay, maybe I will pick on what you said, because I think an architect is a citizen as any other. So maybe what you intended to say is a voice in the field of architecture. That's what I understood by your words. And I'm an architect myself, and I've been doing some pop-up interventions for some years.
Controversial.
So one of my goals by doing this is to, because I feel I have the need, I have the right to work. So this is a way to find work in my field of knowledge. So maybe to have a voice then, I don't know. Let's hope. And also I think this is a bit like the Banksy effect applied to architecture. Like street art, for instance, the artists go in the street and does something that is illegal, no? And then some of them become world famous and have a lot of success and are integrated in the system. So I don't know, maybe many of the pop-up architects or that are doing pop-up interventions, they think it's a way to get there. I don't know. So regarding the matter of political stance, I think anyone here agrees that we live in a capitalist society. So if you want to change things, then you should vote on the Communist Party, maybe. And as I know, in Russia and East countries, before there was plumbing, heating, electricity, people were not dying in the snow, like cold, and maybe, I don't know. There's always things like that in Japan and in the United States. So, but yes, my experience, I agree with something that was said there, but it's very complex. You know, last year I was working on a festival in Brussels, collaborating in a Raumlabor project in the neighborhood of Anderlecht. The town hall picked a series of empty plots in that neighborhood, and that's inhabited by many immigrants. And they chose like 10 architecture teams to make some interventions, temporary ones. And that gave me the opportunity to be with the neighbors and the inhabitants and to listen to their needs. And in the end, it's all a matter of plumbing, electricity, and heating. People don't care if you do a nice temporary building because they have their own problems, like architects and everyone else. So that's one point of view.
I've been listening to all of this and all these serious matters that we've been discussing, and I'm always thinking, where's the fun part of all of this? I'm thinking where architecture is always a long process, no? Before we start until we can actually do something, and pop up, it's a smaller process. So I think, is it possible to be fun? Is it possible to do funny things with that? And by that, I give an example. In Guimarães, I think I remember one intervention by Like Architects that they transformed a fountain into a swimming pool. And I thought that was really funny, and I think they still had something to say when they were doing that. And that is my question. Is it possible to be funny, or when it's fun, it's just entertainment? Is it still architecture? What is that? I don't know. That's my question.
Okay, that's fine.
Why do you think there are just young people making pop-up interventions?
Okay.
I don't know old people working in this field.
Okay.
Okay, Guimarães is on the table, and I have to plead guilty towards a lot of things that have been spoken here, because performance architecture was part of the program that I ran there. And I believe that there are a couple of things that I think people are trying to separate without quite managing. Yes, they can be fun. Yes, they can give voice. I obviously do not agree with the patronizing aspects of giving someone a voice. Actually, I would like to change the word to voices because I think it's more important. But I believe that European money can be spent doing stuff that they weren't quite expecting, but actually is doing something else rather than this shiny golden stars over a blue background that they eventually expected. And we've managed to do that in Guimarães in a lot of ways. And so it's about tools. It's about giving a tool. I teach as well, and I'm a lot more interested in, as opposed to teaching how to use a tool, enabling the student to discover which tool is adequate to his or her problem. And I think that's a little bit what we try to do, in a sense, not to prescribe a voice or a discourse or a narrative, but to enable a ground in which sometimes the reaction was not what we expected at all, but that's what it is. So yeah, we can do good things with European money, and it's running out. We've done a few, and I spoke earlier about the issue of time. It takes a lot of time to actually evaluate the impact of what we've done in Guimarães, for example. And I think in 10 years we'll be able to...
What's your evaluation now, though?
Now?
Yeah, because you know, it was a year ago, so
yes.
Presumably there's some form of legacy in the city, but I'm not at all clear what.
Well, the city, we were very lucky because the city has a completely, an exemplar public space. It's very well done, you know, via, you know, a very dear architect and very good one. And it's very used. So people come out to drink beer and have fun, but they respect and cherish their public space. So in a sense, I believe that we had a very good grounds to work from. But it is a city that has been, it's lost its industry. And so there's a high level of unemployment, and a lot of, the outlook is not very positive. So in a sense, we worked with a lot of unemployed people, and I'm not saying that we've given them solutions for their life, but at least we managed to create moments in which the outlook could be reassessed. And so if...
In what way? Sorry to push you on this.
If their position in the world is reassessed, somehow we made a difference. And we had Archigram there, for example, which was quite an impactful exhibition, because in a sense people think, oh, it's supposed to be the future, it's supposed to be now. But yet the problems are the same in the 60s or now. Overcrowding, mobility, all those problems are there, were there, and are still, you know, present today. And so it's this evaluation of where we are in the world that I believe is important to do with whatever result. And pop-up, temporary, the awareness of the political aspects of the built environment, all that I think contributes in different levels. Yeah. And small is beautiful sometimes.
Yeah, but then you look back to the 1960s and you might say, well, Archigram's response to that problem of mobility was to create walking cities, you know, entire cities that walked around. Today's response to the problem of mobility is to make people walk, to force people to inhabit walkable environments. So the kind of different magnitude of ambition and solutions. And I think one of the sort of reasons for having this type of discussion is to try and assess the type of solutions that we're thinking about today, which are maybe not sort of so ambitious as in the past, but maybe you don't agree with me. So any final questions or last points? I'm going to come to all of you in a minute, but is there any final points? Any burning questions that you've got that you've not asked?
Okay, two things. Just to remind that precisely Guimarães is not a one-man's work, but it's actually the continuous work of a team of people both at the local architecture office, the city hall office, with the people and the more like elite people who love Guimarães and who fought for certain urban transformations, who made it possible. So again, a real process of engaging with between architecture and local people. Just one thing about the hijacked fountains, right? Which is a project that I truly hate because it's absolutely empty, it's absolutely theatrical, it has no engagement whatsoever except just the fun of an image, right? So that's it.
What comes down in terms of what we talked about and what I think is that there's a bit of a confusion of talking about different things and naming the same. I think that's something that gets me more anxious. I think that we have to separate what is actually what is the purpose of each kind of intervention, because they have different purposes, they have different clients, they have different authors. And for example, what I think is the most interesting piece of works that were done in interventions, and I say interventions, I don't say temporary architecture, they could be or not, is the ones that actually dissolve the authorship, and this becomes just a matter of coordination, of implementing basic ideas, and then giving freedom, possible freedom, of course, but there is no freedom actually, so might as well have some, and giving this possibility of doing something else, and learning from this process, and then see what happens. Small scale at first, if it could grow into something else, could not grow, could turn, it could happen to don't have any quite clear effect, but it can change, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it grows into something else, and it actually changes cities. And I do believe that it does change cities with time, even if each of those are quick. But in time, they layer. And cities are made of layers, are made of problems that are one top of the others, are made of people with different needs, made of all sorts of things, are made of marketing, of capitalism, of empty politics, which we deal with every day. And if we can just for a moment think about what we are doing daily and think about whether we can do it differently, this is quite political, and this is very important at a time that we don't really have a clear effect on the political aspects of in general, in the country, etc. The change is not visible. Of course, nothing is quick and fast as we want, but as soon as we learn from all of those experiments, the sooner we can actually do more with less and still do everything else that we were talking about that is on the sideline of this that I think is important. Because the main things, the big projects, the main urban planning, the photographies for the projects that are sold in the world, empty or not, will continue to happen. But there is things to be done.
I find myself coming back to this point. I mean, I became an architect to have an impact on the world. And part of that is creating a different world than the one that I came into. And I feel there's a lot of conservatism in the sense of promoting this idea of small is beautiful, which I disagree with fundamentally. And it's offensive to fat people as well. And to me, it's all about going out there and really transforming the world. You know, I mean, I'm not young anymore, but I'm going to pretend that I'm like you, same age group. But we're supposed to be about, again, where's that desire to create the society that represents us? That's the energy of the generation of the 60s, and that's why the bastards are still running the world now, because they had that self-confidence, and people like Archigram still pontificating, or Rem Koolhaas or whoever, whereas we're sort of, I feel, with these pop-up interventions in a very shallow, repetitive manner, repeating formalistically some of the devices they did, You can find the traces for any of these trends you're talking about, whether guerrilla urbanism or whatever. You can find them back in the situations, the international, and all of that. We're kind of repeating these gestures in an empty way. To me, I mean, it's harmless. We can do it. But where is the next big idea? How am I going to fly to work next week? And part of that, a big element, is the objective material of architecture. Is the plumbing, the wiring, all that kind of thing, giving people the space, the housing, the heating. We cannot ignore these things. And we sort of, I feel to me, it's just a complete cop-out. It's a complete saying, we don't have any big ideas. Let's just distract ourselves with these little things and pretend we're political about it. And that's completely an abdication of responsibility. Where is our vision of the cities we want to live in? That's where we need to be thinking about. Thank you.
I would like to get back on the idea of the internet that was talked about before, and also about the voices, because I think the internet somehow gave us the abstract space to have a voice, but I think the problem is that people don't see any consequences to those calls for something that they're calling. And I think the city has the potential to give people the tools to see the reflection of their needs and of their desires. And I would also like to think of the concept of fun that was talked about before, because I think the best example that I can give is Casa do Vapor, because I don't know if it's, I think everybody knows about it. Because every time that I heard people that were working there talking about it, they all talked about how much fun they had, but it's a completely different concept of fun, which is not something that you look at or that you think, oh, this is so beautiful, and then you get back to your life and it's all the same. It's something that you engage on and you actually participate in, think about, and you see something that it's partially yours. So I think this is. Oh, and I also think the concept of temporary is. I think it's also. We are afraid to commit to something that we're not sure if it works or if it doesn't. But I think it has the potential to be something permanent. Or
if I would have spoken before Carl, I think I would say something very similar. I agree with almost everything that Carl said. And I think this is the main problem. I remember that some years ago I was seeing a kind of pop-up intervention in the center of Paris, and I was seeing how they were engaged in new experience with the city, with the others, putting a kind of couches in the square, bringing the interior of the palace to the exterior, to some kind of new interaction with the social contact, with the memory, etc. Everybody seemed very relaxed. Everybody was enjoying these big couches. Everybody was like drinking beer, and this was like 2007, and in the periphery of Paris there was these huge burnings. You know, these young people from the banlieue that were burning the cars and were desperate because they were out of perspectives, out of jobs. And in the other side, after these walls that seem that still exist, this kind of young people was like enjoying their own, let's say, decadence, maybe. You know, and this is the problem. It's about what we want. It's about low expectations and what we want to do with our work and with our life. And because we have to understand that with this, we are not just in a kind of economical crisis, financial. We are within a crisis of political institutions, democratic institutions. And if we are not more responsible about what is happening around us, maybe in the next 2 years, maybe it's we that are burning cars because they took out all our expectations to the future. And I think it's about this. You just, if you want to do something with your work, if you want to propose to something bigger, I think this idea of you just can intervene in the small scale, it's a kind of abdication, you know. I know that I can do anything more, so I just make this small. It's true. I'm sorry, but it's true. it will have, for sure, some results, some long results. But if you don't intervene in the macro scale, you will be in the banlieue fighting for your job. And I think this is, if you want to talk about activism, political activism in architecture, we have to take this in our hands. And we understand that... no, not necessarily. This is already... no. You cannot say... They cannot say that your only political activity is only to elect someone in 4 years. This is not true. This is not democracy. And freedom, not to invoke for me, the big problem is if you want to speak about freedom, there is no freedom without being political. And there were some guys that we still, after 2,000 years, heard about them. It was the Greek. Could have been just a very temporary experience, but they understand that there is no freedom if you don't take your political destiny in your hands. Hmm?
But they have many slaves.
Right.
That's not, this is a very poor way of seeing it, because you know who were not slaves in the Greek city? The ones that were not political. And we don't have this political. We are not political because we don't manage to participate in the management of the city. We, for the Greek, are slaves because we don't have any political participation in the destinies of the city, of our common, of our republic, you know. This is the question that we have to ask ourselves. If we just simply abdicate to have this political commitment, we are becoming slaves of a power that is more and more getting abstract. And this is the problem.
Good. Very good. I feel like we're just getting warmed up somehow. We should... Is the bar going to be open for a while? Anyway, we should stick around and have this argument out over a drink further. Because, you know, it's quite interesting. I hope that proved interesting, useful, inspiring even. I thought I've kind of avoided largely saying what I thought through all of this, but I'm going to have my tuppence worth at the end of it. Because, you know, to me, the comments that came from, I think, from yourself about, you know, it's working in pop-ups and temporary architecture and small-scale projects is a practical solution to hard times. You know, I take that, and I don't see anything wrong with that. And I think some of these projects are actually quite interesting and can be a useful way of experimenting with new ideas and all the rest of it. The problem that I've got, and the reason why I kind of wanted to do this discussion on pop-ups, because I thought, you know, it's a useful indication of how we think about architecture more widely. And for me, you know, if you look at the kind of discussion on pop-ups, both amongst architects themselves and particularly amongst critics and kind of the sort of people that write about them, then I think you can see a number of things in the discussion. So, for example, lots of people celebrate pop-ups because they use materials that are found in the area or recycled materials or all this sort of stuff. Whereas I think, you know, at a time of recession and of a downturn, we actually need to have much more innovative and inventive and imaginative ways of finding new materials, more materials. We need to use more resources, not just now celebrate using less materials. The same thing goes with the whole way that pop-ups are celebrated as a craft intervention. You know, this is a reaction against the whole idea that architects have used too many, you know, there's been too much high-tech architecture over recent years. To my mind, we haven't got enough high-tech architecture. We need more technologies, more innovation in that area, not a retreat into the methods of a century ago. When you know, the pop-ups invariably celebrate their small scale. Now, I've not got a problem with small-scale interventions, but when it becomes a celebration of that, it's usually a sign that people object to what they see as an era of excess that we've just gone through in the past period. And that, I think, is a problem, because I don't think the past has been an era of excess. I think it's been an era of not enough. So I think, you know, we should be bigger and more ambitious. And the problem with the pop-ups discussion is that it actually curtails our ambition. It celebrates the restraint that we're living under rather than tries to break through it. So that's the kind of, you know, that's why I was interested in pop-ups as a discussion. I kind of hope that it's been an enjoyable evening. If anybody's interested in continuing the discussion, then not only stick around for a drink for the next hour or so, but come along to the architecture school tomorrow night where I'll give a talk which will be on some of these issues. It's called Do We Need a New Avant-Garde? And we can continue the argument, hopefully. Okay, thanks very much.